to the Law Week webinar on domestic violence during COVID-19. My name is Sally Nicholes and I'm Managing Partner at Nicholes Family Lawyers, and I'm facilitating this webinar for Law Week today. In this new landscape of the coronavirus, there is growing concern amongst family violence academics, service providers and family law practitioners that there is a spike in the incidence of family violence in our community, predominantly as a consequence of increased social isolation and financial pressures on families brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic. Violence is never acceptable. It is now more important than ever that members of our community report suspected or observed incidences of family violence and abuse to ensure the protection of our most vulnerable is paramount. It is also so important that those most at risk and vulnerable know where to reach out for help, what services are available, and that there are key stakeholders who are moving mountains to address their welfare, all working collaboratively to do what they can to support those at risk and to send a message to perpetrators that this conduct will have consequences and it is not acceptable at any time, especially now. It is often situations of financial distress and social isolation that lead to instances of family violence, both of which are rife in the current social circumstances. As such, it is imperative that victims of family violence and abuse are supported in the knowledge that family violence services and support avenues, including the family court, are still readily available. Now, I'd like to introduce our panellists today. Joining our panel to discuss these pertinent issues are His Honour, the Chief Justice of the Federal Circuit Court and the Family Court, William Alstergren. The Honourable William Alstergren is the Chief Justice of the Family Court of Australia and the Chief Justice of the Federal Circuit Court of Australia, and has a number of new family violence initiatives that he would like to talk about and highlight. There is Jessica Stott, who is the Acting CEO of the Women's Information and Referral Exchange, known as WIRE. WIRE is a non-for-profit organisation providing free generalist information, support and referral services to women, non-binary and gender diverse people in Victoria. Vincent Papaleo, Director of Vincent, Papaleo and Associates. Vincent is a clinical psychologist with specialist expertise in the clinical aspects of family law. Vince is renowned in the Melbourne family law jurisdiction for his work as a report writer, counsellor and consultant. Helen Matthews, who is the Principal Lawyer at the Women's Legal Service Victoria. The Women's Legal Service is a non-for-profit organisation providing legal services to women who are experiencing disadvantage, including family violence in Victoria. And finally, Alison Macdonald, the Acting CEO of Domestic Violence Victoria, which is the peak body for specialist family violence services for women and children in Victoria. So welcome to all of our panellists and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Sally.
Hi.
So, do we think the way family violence is being perpetrated has changed during COVID-19 and why? Do we think the way family violence has been reported has changed during COVID-19 and why? This is something I'd like to put to our panellists, and firstly to Alison from Domestic Violence Victoria. Alison, can you describe the shift from a legal and social perspective that has occurred in the incidence of domestic violence given the current situation? What is considered domestic violence in the current landscape?
Thanks, Sally. And look, how we understand family violence hasn't changed. Family violence is when someone behaves abusively towards a family member, and it's a pattern of behaviour that controls or dominates a person and causes them to fear for their own or others' safety and well-being. We know that family violence doesn't take the form of a single incident. It's ongoing behaviour that gradually undermines victim survivors' confidence and their ability to leave the violent person. The forms of family violence that we're seeing during the pandemic haven't changed either. We know that it takes many forms and none of which are mutually exclusive. And while physical violence might be the most visible form, others such as sexual, emotional, social, spiritual and economic abuse can be equally as harmful. What we're particularly concerned about, however, during the pandemic period is that COVID-19 and the associated community containment measures are being weaponised, if you like, by people who choose to use violence against their family members. And the pandemic's being used to justify abusive and controlling behaviours. We know there's been a really intense focus on family violence since the pandemic first hit Australia, and scrutiny of what we can expect to see here. And we've been really looking to learn from the experience of other countries who were maybe weeks or months ahead of us in terms of community containment and transmission of the virus, and also where we've seen different patterns emerge. And we were really aware early on that other countries were reporting significant increases in reported family and domestic violence, and an increase in risk and severity too. We haven't necessarily seen that same trajectory in Victoria, but we're still very concerned about what some of the trends are telling us. So we know from a lot of international evidence on natural disasters that there are spikes in family violence and violence against women more broadly in post-emergency situations. We know this from Australia's experience with bushfires, we know from floods, from cyclones, and it's a pattern that we have a lot of international evidence on in other post-disaster contexts. It's really important to understand that leading into the pandemic coming to Australia, there was already extremely high demand on the Australian family violence service system. We of course had the aftermath of the horrendous bushfires, but you'll also recall Hannah Clark's murder and her children's murder in Queensland, and the intense media focus around that period, which really did across the whole of Australia, drove a really significant increase in demand on the service system. And so we kind of entered the pandemic with that frame. What we're hearing from our member services, who are the face-to-face agencies that work with victim survivors in the community, is that there's been a significant increase in onset, frequency and severity of family violence. And we've been really keeping a close eye on the trends that are emerging in terms of perpetration. So I'll just talk through some of the examples of what we're hearing. So for example, isolating someone from family and friends is a very common tactic that we see in family violence. And I think the social isolation measures that are in place now are providing perpetrators of family violence with more opportunities to force victim survivors to isolate from their family, from their friends, from community support networks, or indeed from the support of their workplaces if they've lost their employment due to the pandemic, or even if they're working remotely. We know that stalking and surveillance of victim survivors through technology is also a very common feature of family violence, and where people are in social isolation with perpetrators, we're seeing that this actually increases opportunities to control and monitor their movements and their communications through mobiles, through other geolocating technologies, for example. We're hearing about tightening controls over finance, and increase in financial abuse. Also explicit threats of spreading or deliberately contracting the virus to exert control. So for example, through threatening to expose children to COVID-19, inviting people into the home and saying that they have COVID-19. We're hearing about taking children who might be under family law parenting orders, refusing to return them because they've been exposed to COVID-19, or don't trust that the victim has not got COVID-19. So there's a lot of anecdotal evidence coming through from the service system about the ways that the pandemic is being kind of manipulated to exert these kinds of controlling behaviours. We're hearing about increases in migration-related abuse as well, which is also really common, where threats of deportation for people in Australia without permanent residency are used to keep victim survivors from seeking support. Often also includes the threat of child removal. And some of the most vulnerable victim survivors of family violence are women without permanent residency living in Australia, and the pandemic has made their situations all the more precarious. In terms of sort of predicting what's coming next, of course, the world's never seen the likes of this global pandemic in the current era, and the predictions, I think, about the impact on the most marginalised and disadvantaged communities are really concerning, particularly concerning, I think, in terms of the gendered impact of the pandemic, where the predictions are that women are going to bear a disproportionate burden of the economic impact. But it also includes the risk of family violence, and we're quite concerned that once social restrictions lift, there could well be a surge in demand for support. So that's sort of a bit of an overview of what we're seeing and how we're keeping abreast of the trends in the current period.
And can you speak to any of the changes that have been specifically implemented by your organisation in response to COVID?
My organisation, Domestic Violence Victoria, is the peak for family violence services in Victoria. So our members are all the face-to-face service delivery organisations across the state, providing crisis and case management support, refuge services, providing information and counselling, other therapeutic supports. So our focus has very squarely, since the start of the pandemic, been on supporting those direct service delivery agencies to adapt to the pandemic. So all specialist family violence services in Victoria remain open and operational. Most of them have transitioned to remote service delivery and have service delivery continuity plans in place. The modes of service delivery have changed. So there's decreased face-to-face and direct outreach support, but most organisations are still doing the work that they do over the telephone or in online platforms. We understand that some services are still providing skeleton staff in the office or in crisis accommodation services, for example. Some are still providing staff who might do court support work, for example, all following physical distancing requirements and using PPE where they can. We're doing a lot of support. We're doing a lot of work with the Victorian government at the moment because we know that for a lot of victim survivors, the opportunities to make direct contact with support services can be significantly curtailed. But what we know is that there are a lot of other frontline workforces that may still have opportunities to have face-to-face contact with victim survivors. And so we're looking at how we can kind of build the capability of our sector to do a lot of secondary consultation and collaborative work with those workforces that will continue to have contact with and eyes on people who, adults and children who might be at risk during the pandemic period.
Oh, thank you for that, Alison. And moving on to the Family Court and the Federal Circuit Court, Your Honour, how has the Family Court responded to the influx of matters related to COVID-19?
Oh, thanks, Sally. It's been an interesting exercise, I think, for all the people involved. You know, if you'd said 8 weeks ago that we'd be facing the kind of situations we've been facing, we wouldn't have believed it. Being an organisation based on precedent, you can imagine how devastating it is and how challenging it is. But at the same time, I think we were really in 4 stages. The first stage was really a reaction phase. We went from very much hearing about the virus and not really having a lot in place to very quickly having to shut down at least one court, having to go from face-to-face hearings to reducing them to an hour and a half and having telephone hearings, having to audit the kind of resources we had to be able to do Microsoft Teams or other video conferencing, and then having to roll that out across the courts because, like most other organisations, we had to engage in what was called a long-term digital transformation. And thanks to the IT department, who are now the most important people in the court rather than the Chief Justice, we are able now to roll that out to 104 judges and 35 registrars across 14 different locations around Australia. So really the first stage was a reaction phase. The second stage was really looking at what we could do to actually develop it. And the development stage took about 3 weeks. By Easter, we'd rolled out Microsoft Teams to all the court to keep things active. But I have to say the overall approach was it was never an option for us to close down. It was never an option for us to wholesale vacate hearings because we provide an essential service for Australian families. And particularly in times of crisis, they need to know that we're there. They need to know that there's ramifications if people don't act reasonably, and they need to know that the spirit of, if not the precise terms of, parenting orders or shared parenting arrangements is observed. We've been lucky enough to put a number of things in, including obviously curtailing our processes to include a number of practice notes to allow people not to have to file sworn affidavits, for instance, and other sworn documents. We've been able to assist with the great use of work at the profession to roll out electronic mediations and to ensure wherever possible that not only duty lists continued, but also the final order applications continued. We also looked at what we could do from a process base. So when we did have face-to-face, we were one of the first courts to produce a face-to-face protocol, not just for judges to actually conduct very short hearings in court, but also for registrars and also for CDS to make sure that that important work could continue, which it has. So that's all turned electronic, if I can put it that way. And that's something which has been used not only by us, but also some of the courts in England now with the kind of establishment of relationships we've got with them to try and keep up with what's going on. So one of the other things we've done is we've actually, with the help of Angela Lynch and the Queensland Women's Legal Service, and obviously also the legal services both in New South Wales and of course with Victoria, particularly with Helen Matthews, who's here today, we've been able to develop a COVID-19 list. And it's a first opportunity for us to be able to put parameters in place so we can make sure we have a dedicated national specialist list for urgent applications which are COVID related. And it was launched last week. I'm pleased to say it's going very well. We've got two very energetic and highly skilled registrars that are able to triage these cases as they come in, make sure that they are cases which obviously suit our criteria, and over 90% have. And then deal with them within 72 hours. So what that means is we've been able to assign them to a docket judge if need be, or they've dealt with them themselves, or we've brought someone in. We're also able to transfer them easily between the Federal Circuit Court and Family Court. So the Deputy Chief Justice, Robert McClellan, will be handing a decision down today on a cross-border dispute. One of our first ones is going to be judicially determined. We're able to react very quickly. And we think that's a great thing for the future. The other things we looked at is how can we assist with the identification of risk very early in litigation and make sure that we continue on the long term with that. So as well as the COVID list, we've also looked at also how we can increase risk screening. There's a project called the Doors Project, which is now called the Lighthouse Project in relation to risk screening. That involves screening parenting matters for family law in safety risks at the point of filing, triaging an appropriate pathway based on the identification of risk, and maintaining a specialist list to hear those matters as assessed involving high risk or family violence. That's being rolled out at the moment, and it will commence in October. It's a very exciting project for us, and it's the actual specialist list is going to be called the Everett list after Elizabeth Everett, who was our first, of course, Family Court Chief Justice and an eminent female barrister and lawyer who also was the first Australian to be invited on the Human Rights Committee. The third thing we've done apart from that is look at also what we can do in relation not only to risk screening, but also look at what we can do in relation to a more involvement with registrars. And that's one thing we're working with the government on at the moment. I'm happy to say that backlog hasn't increased regardless of the pandemic, and we've got a clearance rate of over 85% in both courts.
And it was really important, Your Honour, we've all heard you on the radio, you had to really go out there and myth bust, because I think from our perspective, a lot of women and talking to Wire and working with them especially, thought that the courts were closed. We had a number of occasions where women were contacting us saying, I'm in self-isolation, I'm being terrorised, but we understand the family court is closed. So I understand that's why you actually went out and actually made sure that you issued in your own name these statements to say, no, where we are operating. And that was one of the important agendas for you, to make sure that victim survivors knew that there was somewhere to go to.
Well, thanks, Lee. Yeah, we were really keen to make sure everybody knew that we were open for business, that we were continuing to provide an essential service for Australian families, which the judges all take terribly seriously, and to make sure that people knew there were ramifications for inappropriate or unreasonable behaviour. The other thing we were very keen to do is ensure that people knew that they were expected to abide by the spirit of shared parenting orders, even if they physically couldn't comply. So if a supervision or supervising service closed, or whether a school closed and so there was difficulty with exchange points, all those kind of issues, or there's cross-border difficulties, they were required to try and see if they could find a reasonable way to move around them. And I'm happy to say, on the whole, there's been some incredibly responsible decent people out in the community who've dropped their differences and actually worked out a way to solve them. They haven't had to come to court to solve them. They've been able to agree in writing through WhatsApp or through text or otherwise, which helps us enormously. But there's always going to be cases where you have to intervene, where you have to protect people, particularly children, and often, as we know, so many women in our society who are vulnerable, and we want to make sure they're not alone, and we're actually taking our responsibilities very seriously. And I have to say the profession and the service providers have been fantastic in their cooperation with that.
And we're really lucky to have some of those service providers here today. So I'd love to hear from them, maybe starting with you, Helen. What risk factors have you seen with women being exposed in these current circumstances?
In the areas that we practice in, which are family law, family violence, as in the intervention orders, and child protection, there are a number of increased risks that women are facing at the moment. And one of the risks is in couples who are still living together, but where one person is a perpetrator and the other person is a victim survivor of family violence, the opportunity to be able to seek out assistance is really terribly limited. So our concern is that there is an underrepresentation of the problems that are being experienced in the community coming to our attention and the attention of family violence services and the courts. So while there has been an increase in applications to the family law courts for urgent hearings, there will still be a number of people who are not able to get out and access the services and the systems that are available to them to resolve their problems. So what we're seeing from the people who seek out our services and also talking with our colleagues at Victoria Legal Aid, what they're seeing, that there is a high number of people separated families where people are making contact with legal services to see how can they overcome problems that have arisen in their parenting arrangements. So they're actually seeking out that assistance, and it's one of the reasons why we welcome the COVID-19 list that the Federal Circuit Court and Family Court are offering. But we also find that there are women who are not yet separated and may not have had the violence that they might be experiencing come to the attention of, for example, Victoria Police, who might instigate a safety notice and remove a perpetrator from a home. Those people are not necessarily making contact with any legal service, because to do so would be to increase the risk that they're already experiencing. What Victoria Legal Aid has told us is that on their web chat line, is that they have they've had an increase in women accessing that, because that's something you can do, silently and quietly in a corner, and a decrease in the correlating in the phone calls to their legal helpline. Most of the people who come to see us for advice or detailed advice and ongoing representation are referred to us by family violence agencies. So they are experiencing some reduction in calls being made to them. We anticipate, and it's already beginning to show, that this will change, that there will be something of a storm after the calm, where people's circumstances will become so desperate that they're going to have to seek assistance. And hopefully that's happening prior to any sort of damages being done from which there can be no recovery. But our service remains open, and I agree it is confusing for members of the public seeing courts that they can't simply walk into and understanding that those courts are open. Our duty lawyer services at the various courts that we work in are only operating remotely. All of our staff are working from home, but we have over a number of years been providing advice services by video conferencing, so that we are able to service the sort of regional areas in the state. So we're able to continue doing that in the same way as we were doing it before, albeit it's from somebody's spare room rather than from our offices in Melbourne. So I think we are concerned that we have women experiencing family violence who might have the police intervene and remove a violent partner from the home. But those matters, while they might convert to an intervention order at the magistrates' court, the parties are not required to attend court. So that's either the perpetrator of the violence, the respondent to the order, or the affected family member are certainly being advised that they do not have to attend court. And this is a response to, you know, the health and safety needs because of the pandemic. And the courts are extending these orders and will be providing them with hearing dates at some point in the future. There is not the same level of court oversight that was happening before, in the sense that the magistrate is not explaining to the perpetrator what the obligations of an intervention order might place on them. If the perpetrator is not there, they're only getting the order served on them at a later stage. The affected family member is not receiving the legal advice that might help her make sure that she reports breaches, or that she understands the other related legal issues that are relevant to her, such as how she might sit in the family law world if her children are also included in the order, which is likely to be the case. So, look, I think it's a complicated position that we're in. It's difficult for all of us to navigate, and even though I agree with everybody that there's been some really goodwill on the part of the profession and other stakeholders and on the courts, but we do have there are some difficulties, and those difficulties, of course, are all the more greater for people who are experiencing the stress and trauma of family violence. So, you know, there are some concerns.
And all the more reason why it's wonderful to have Law Week as a forum and a platform
Certainly.
to be able to have this discussion and for people to access this webinar. So it's really, thank you so much, Helen, for being here as well. That's really sage comments. And I was interviewing the CEO of Panda the other day, who deal with new parents and expecting parents, and the same thing, they're getting a reduction in calls, and that concerns them greatly because midwives aren't able to actually, maternal health nurses, aren't able to actually do the normal screening that they would be doing for domestic violence. So they are very concerned that self-isolation has had an impact. Jessica, for you, as providing services to women, you have your telephone call service. Have you found that the types of dynamics that we've been discussing have been hitting your callers?
Absolutely. I relate a lot to what you say, Helen. The issue of people being confined to their homes with perpetrators is really present all of the time. And I think it's really interesting to note that it's not always the partner who is the perpetrator. We've had examples of also the adult children perpetrating violence, which would fit into a family violence dynamic, that if a family of parents and children are in a home and there's an abusive dynamic, that the children may be under even more pressure to align with where they see the power sitting. So we've been hearing from people that their adult children have become more abusive during this time as well, which is quite concerning. And also heard examples of people trying to find alternative accommodation away from their abusive partners, but then finding that those places weren't safe either. People could be seeking support or seeking a safe place living with their parents or a family member, but often people are under so much pressure in those situations that they're not particularly safe options either. So just the options that people have for finding safe places to be is very limited at the moment. I find it very interesting to look at the DVRCV infographic of the red flags. One of the red flags, which is the red flags indicate heightened risk of death or serious injury. And one of them is perpetrator unemployment. So we can imagine that there's a huge amount of that at the moment that is increasing risk for people who are in relationships where there's an abuse of power. But we've also been having a lot of reports of other red flags as well, including access to weapons, choking, sexual assault, and drug and alcohol misuse. So it's quite a cocktail of risk factors that people are experiencing at the moment, with not a lot of option to get away from them. Another thing that we find at Wire is that when we have our face-to-face service available, we have a number of people who come in specifically to access computers and the internet and even credit for their phones. And sometimes they even come and receive phones from us as well if the phones increase their safety. So that lack of access to technology, I think, is really significant in this environment where people are not able to go to a neighbourhood house or a public library or somewhere like Wire to access the means to contact a service. Yeah, I think that's a significant barrier that people are experiencing at the moment. And also just for people who do have access to a phone, finding a time and a safe place and an uninterrupted time that they can contact a service is really difficult as well. We've heard every second person we speak to has a child there and is saying now is not a good time to talk about this because I need to find a time where I'm not speaking in front of my child. Yeah, so many additional barriers to accessing service and heightened risk in people's circumstances.
Vince, you've been listening to this as a psychologist. Do you have any comment about how the current situation is likely to exacerbate the experience of children and families affected by the family violence?
Sally, I'd really reiterate everything that's been said thus far. What we know is that the unique circumstances with which we're confronted places a level of stress on vulnerable people that amplifies all of the problems that have then been there previously. So those individuals who have pre-existing mental health problems, heightened levels of distress, when isolated and disconnected from their normal networks and supports, are much more likely to show frayed behaviour, are much more likely to enter into conflict, are much more likely to show symptoms of stress and trauma. And it's interesting, if you look at some of the quarantine research around SARS and Ebola and some of the other pandemics, including equine flu, that one of the features that's been noted in the social science research is that many of the individuals who are the subject of quarantine develop symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, so that they become highly vulnerable, highly anxious, highly reactive. Their level of coping becomes significantly lessened. You place that in the context of the social and emotional and financial stresses that are currently existing, it's not difficult to see why vulnerable people will show a significant amplification and a spike in their difficulties. And for those individuals who are caught in power differential relationships, they're trapped at a time when they themselves may be functioning even less well, including the perpetrator may also be experiencing those same heightened symptoms and amplification. So it's really a very tenuous and difficult time, and I think quite a dangerous time for many families.
And when you think about it, some of those barriers, like for example, schools, and some of the buffers or some of the facilitators where schools would pick up that there was a problem, for example, having the children at home, there's a couple of social implications that I know there's a debate about the health and safety of people contracting coronavirus, but then a lot of people are focusing on the education, but not necessarily recognising that schools do pick up a lot of distress with children, as you would well know.
Indeed, and just that whole sense of a pressure valve being released, that children can go to school, that people can go and network with others, can see other mothers, can go to the doctor, can go shopping, can connect to extended family, can access services. All of those have been removed simultaneously. So the sense that people are isolated and alone and feeling stuck within their situation with no escape is really paramount. I really want to echo what the Chief Justice said, however, and that is that the families I've seen, I have really impressed upon them that this is not an excuse to behave differently, that unacceptable behaviour is unacceptable, full stop, that there are real and measurable consequences, that they should go to the police, that they should be speaking to their lawyers, that they should be acting, and they should not be working within this myth that there's nothing that can be done.
It is, and I think you and I have seen a number of examples. We talked early days about, and where we encouraged people to take action, and the police were incredibly responsive, and so were the courts.
Yeah, indeed. The other cluster of families that I'm seeing, Sally, that cluster of families that are just experiencing much more heightened tension and stress within the unit. They're not falling within the category that we would typically describe as family violence, but just they are really not coping. And the conflict between them is escalating symmetrically, and they just don't have an escape. And I found that intervening with those families much more assertively, much more directly, being much more interventionist has really been helpful. to not simply sit back and reflect, but get in there, roll your sleeves up and say, what we need to do is this. You need to go and see this person. This is what we need to do in order to overcome this problem. What are the options? So it becomes more of a crisis intervention and a solution-focused intervention rather than just allowing this family to drift on until somehow it gets before a decision maker to have matters resolved.
And the knowledge now that there is a COVID list, for example, must
Absolutely.
be so reassuring for you when you're actually giving those direct, having those direct discussions with people.
And trying to encourage the lawyers to be much more active and constructively active, and to work within not only the spirit of the orders, but to use some plain common sense to find solutions and look at opportunities to make things better in this very difficult, uniquely difficult time.
Is there anything that anyone would actually like to add to the webinar? I know we've actually been going, would you believe, for an hour. Is there anything else that anyone would like to actually add at all?
Look, Sally, I would like to add that, that we are really encouraging other agencies to explain those people who are experiencing family violence or who might be perpetrating the family violence, the importance of them actually seeking some legal advice. And I appreciate Vincent's advice for us to be sensible in our approach to these things and use some common sense. But we need to have the opportunity to speak to the people themselves in the first place. And I think whereas when we were physically present in courts, we would have many people coming up and seeing us because we were there. When they simply say, oh, here's the phone number, give these people a call when your matter's coming up in court. I mean, and of course, we much prefer to be well prepared and not just doing things on a duty basis at court. But for those matters where people are ordinarily not engaging with lawyers because of costs or because of their attitude to the use of lawyers, that efforts are really made to connect them with legal services or with legal practitioners so that they can receive that advice, that reality checking, and maybe avoid them making some entrenching some bad decisions or some mistakes that they've already begun to make in these changed and difficult circumstances. So yeah, making those referrals stick is the problem that we have at the moment. Not just here's a number, see how you go.
Yeah, I mean the number of litigants in person, I think, is still increasing. I think I'm right in that statistic.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, and yourself, Jessica, was there anything else that you wanted to add in terms of that access to help promote this access to justice?
Sure. Just wanted to add that at Wire we're taking quite a long time with people at the moment, spending more time. We're finding that people are quite cautious to kind of share their story, and it's taking a little bit longer to establish safety and rapport, but we're very committed to doing that with people and supporting people to explore the options that are going to work for them. The first thing that we check when we speak to people is that it's a safe time for them to talk. So safety is always paramount in our minds. We're very attentive at the moment to cues of suicidality, and there's always staff on hand to provide special support for anyone who is feeling suicidal. And that our team is being structured in a way that it's very strong and supported so that the work that we're doing is safe for the workers and sustainable as well. So we'd really welcome people to keep visiting our website. We're updating information on there all the time, and to contact us via email or chat if that's a more suitable option than the phone.
And Vincent, you're always very passionate about talking and looking through the eyes of a child. In a snapshot, how would children perceive the current situation, particularly if there's incidents of that heightened tension and violence at home? Just for anyone listening, to encourage them to actually take action, just the impact of children, not only of COVID, but having that tension and that violence at home. What's your message to people who are listening?
The children are vulnerable. Children are reliant on the adults around them. Children need to be kept safe, and the children should be our priority all the time. It is impossibly difficult for some families given their circumstances and the restrictions, and obviously trying to help them access services and supports is of immense importance. But being sensitive to the experience of children and the sense of powerlessness they have, they are completely reliant and dependent upon what their parents say and do. In the power differential imbalance, children can also be very significantly and adversely affected. We know that they don't have to be the direct recipients of the violence to be significantly and severely disturbed by that violence. Ultimately, we know that the caring parent, the better that person is cared for and looked after and supported, the better those children will do. So again, intervention where it's possible and acting where possible. There should never be any excuse for completely unacceptable behaviour.
Your Honour, did you want to comment on any of the other?
Yeah, thanks, Sally. Can I say that I meant to mention something before? One of the things we've looked at is we're still very concerned that there are a number of cases where, as some of the other speakers have mentioned, where people haven't actually made allegations of risk where there are risk. They may be intimidated, they may be very concerned about it, there may be real anxiety in relation to doing that. In the Federal Circuit Court, as you very well know, you're required to indicate a risk if there is one in the first form, but in the family court you're not. I'm very pleased to say after 20 years, as part of the harmonisation of risk, harmonisation of rules project we're doing, we are moving forward with a new notice of risk for both courts on a harmonised basis, which will require people of both courts to actually nominate the very earliest day issue proceedings, whether or not there is a risk. And I think that'll work very well with the Doors project. So that'll be coming out for consultation. But I think by the time this is podcast, it would have happened. And the judges are being very encouraged about it. We want to have a very good consultation process with the profession, and we'll also be having a good consultation with the profession once the actual rules themselves are already released, which will be, I think, a draft will be released by about July. But this notice of risk, we're hoping to start very soon. Can also indicate that we're very encouraged by the idea of using what we call a silver cloud out of all this and actually embrace some of the great improvements in technology. What we're hoping is that if we can have electronic hearings where people are really at risk, rather than having to come into court and be in safe rooms or otherwise, we've now got an opportunity to be able to have people who may be at risk be able to stay in their homes, be in a safe environment where they can actually either give evidence or attend a hearing or otherwise when we come out of this COVID restriction. So we're very encouraged, and those things have really only been made available by the cooperation of the user groups, the service providers, and of course the profession. So I just want to say on behalf of all of us, thank you to everybody involved. They've done a fantastic job. And I really think we're all moving forward together, which is a great initiative, I think, and a great cooperative initiative in the true spirit of what we should all be doing.
Wonderful. And that could be potentially see that COVID list might be renamed but might continue afterwards.
Absolutely.
Those at risk. We've
been talking to, obviously, to Helen and to others, including Angela, in relation to what we can do to further that. We're looking at abductions, for instance, or other areas where it may be suitable for us to have an urgent list that we can actually deal with matters on a particular basis, again, within a very short period of time. So people know they're not alone and they can do something about it. And the judges have now got the ability to be able to do that thanks to the nationalisation of the courts.
Wonderful. And you can imagine perhaps, Helen, that knowing when those lists are operating, there could be duty lawyers attached to them. You never know what
yes.
could come your way. But I remember in the old days, we used to be tapped on the shoulder to go and help people. But unfortunately, as an amicus curiae, but it's an amazing job that you're doing. And thank you so much for your time. Particularly, it's such an amazing community endeavour, Law Week. I'd really like to thank Law Week for approaching us and the Victorian Law Foundation to provide the webinar as part of their Access to Justice Week, and Victorian Women Lawyers, Wire, the Victorian Police, who provided us with quite a bit of data and encouragement, the Victorian Women's Legal Service, and the Family Court and Federal Circuit Court of Australia for engaging and supporting this initiative, and for all being present. Very generous of the Chief Justice to be on this webinar, and also the CEOs of these really important organisations, and Vince, to have your input working with these families at the cold front all the time. Thanks so much for those messages too, particularly about where you place children in here and thinking about how children will perceive it. So many, many thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sally.
Thank you, Sally.
Thank you all.